happy to bring on this next guest here. Been in contact with him actually for a long time. I got in contact with him to prepare for the possible Lions-Eagles matchup that we never got. The Eagles roared to the Super Bowl and to the championship last year. The Lions, the injury issues got them, and they never got to match up with the Eagles. But now we've got a big marquee matchup in the NFC, and so I'm happy to welcome Glenn Erby of Eagles Wire and also Ravens Wire. So welcome to the show, Glenn.
Hey, how are you guys doing?
We're doing well. Yeah, Shayne and I were having a conversation about Philadelphia as a whole, because it has to be interesting to be a journalist in that market in particular, because this is one of the topics I wanted to discuss with the differences between the Lions and the Eagles. But it's an interesting fan base there. All the fan bases have their own identity, and they all have, fans that are great representations of a fan in that market, and then maybe not so much. But Philadelphia, they've got an edge to them. So I'm curious if that kind of comes up, if you get a lot of feedback in that market there.
Certainly. I think some days it's like walking around in the twilight zone, because you'll hear fans, they're telling you, it's the media's fault. You guys are negative. You guys are these things. But then, the A.J. Brown stories and the A.J. Brown stories on Twitch and the A.J. Brown cryptic message, those are some of the most, read and talked about stories. So the fans feed the monster. Everything feeds the monster. You have a 7-2 team, a number 1 seed right now into week 11, but it feels like a twilight zone, and sometimes it feels like, the sky is cratering for the most part.
I feel like that summarizes it well, because having a couple radio shows here, I try to resist that urge, because I like to go to the next level, and Shayne and I are doing that on our show here, because it's like, yeah, that's easy to do, and some of it you do have to cover. It's like, yeah, that A.J. Brown story is a story. You got to cover it. That you didn't tell him to get on that Twitch stream and do that. It happened, and now you got to cover it. But yeah, then people are then swirling around about it, and you can still have an educated discussion about it, which is what we try to do on this show. But I'm curious about your thoughts on that issue as a whole, because Shayne and I were talking about this in the last segment. This does seem like a talent versus culture matchup. The Eagles, in my opinion, being in this market and biased, or not trying to be biased towards the Lions, I think the Eagles have the clear talent advantage, but they seem like a bit of a house of cards to me. Even when they were running to the Super Bowl last year, there's just not a lot of cohesiveness. And whether it's A.J. Brown or other factors, Sirianni isn't the same type of leader as Campbell. So I'm curious how you see all of this developing from your coverage of it.
I mean, I think that the teams are similar in somewhat. The Eagles march to the beat of the drum of their head coach. So from that standpoint, there is a culture there. But I think, like A.J. Brown said yesterday, it's evident, you have a team this explosive. You have a defending Super Bowl champion who leads the NFL in 3 and outs. That, that's unexplainable. Clearly, that's on the offensive system. That's on the offensive coordinator. Yeah, we can sit around all day and talk about the wide receiver. He's a 3-time All-Pro. He's been an All-Pro since the first day, he put on pads in Philadelphia. And, the conversation can be about, okay, well, is this Devontae Smith's time? Is this someone else's time? But clearly the offense is not clicking. Clearly in the offense, the chemistry is not there. The synergy is not there. So it's still something to talk about. But it's definitely a situation where there's a culture there, but there's been a drop-off in offensive line play and offensive efficiency and different things like that. And you have those discussions.
Shayne, you were talking about this a little bit in the last segment, how you kind of want to have people around where you can kind of implement and implant some ideas, whether you're an assistant coach or a player, and kind of get the coach to buy in, or whoever it is, the players to buy in. That's what I'm curious how you see the ecosystem of a team like the Eagles, because they do have an edgy coach, as Glenn was referring to, and then they have players that are kind of acting up, but it's like you need a leader to kind of step in, but it's also going around in a circle. So it's like, who stops the music in that circle of musical chairs and then gets everybody rerouted a different direction?
Yeah, it's the whole classic thing that everyone talks about. There's no I in team, but yet someone else can say, but there's an I in win.
Correct.
You can get away with that sometimes, and I think that when you have players that are, like I talked about before, kind of on the bus, going the same direction, everyone's working together, you don't have that that individuality of someone who's more concerned about their stats or more concerned about a roster bonus or making it to the Pro Bowl or whatever. Like the things that I remembered as a player, you'd see that sometimes. And while individual performances are great to help you and it helps your team, when that's all you're thinking about and you're not willing to be a sacrificial lamb on one play, that becomes an issue. And when you have guys that are all buying in and someone realizes, hey, this isn't the look for me to get the ball, so I'm not going to try to convince my quarterback to get me the ball and force an interception possibly when maybe it's meant for the number 2 receiver on that play or whoever it might be. I've literally witnessed that and seen players like, I want the ball, and then they throw a tantrum when they don't get the ball. And it's like, well, you weren't really a great matchup on that coverage or whatever the situation was, but the quarterback seemed pressured to throw it to you, so now he's throwing an interception because it really wasn't the right decision. And sometimes when you have a lot of that battling and you know, call it egos, call it whatever, that can be a thing. I don't know that that's a huge issue in Philadelphia, but I know that can be a thing. And when you have guys that are all willing to jump on the grenade for each other, it becomes a whole different story.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Can I interrupt and ask Shayne a question?
Go ahead.
As a former player, you take into account, okay, they're 7-2, and you know it's about the team. But as a player, and in this day and age where we know player salaries, we know he makes $32 million a year. How does that impact his idea? Because if he catches 50 balls for 950 yards, is he still going to make that amount? I would like to know what you think in terms of, because that's what I sit here and think like, okay, well, you know, we understand it's about the team, but then we can also understand why he's snapping out. So as a former player, can we get your insight on that?
It's a very, very, very fine line, and also that line can be blurred a lot because, you know, we don't know how long we're going to be able to play. We don't know how long we're going to have the same earning potential. So you want to, you know, take as many big bites out of the apple as you can while you have the chance. I completely understand that, but I also think there's a way of going about it where you can take the role that is given to you, and you understand, like, if I show my bitterness, if I show my attitude that I am unhappy, and I present it to the world, that negative energy is toxic, and that negative energy is also, you know, it's like a disease that can spread way too easy, and when you present that negative body language, you know, your teammates feed off that energy, and it's like, okay, well then you make a mistake. And all you've been talking about is everybody else's mistakes. But now it's your mistake. How do you bite that? How do you eat that yourself? Is it your body language? Do you act like, okay, I got it, I got the next one, and everybody's pushing you along and helping you and pulling you along to get over that mistake? Or have you turned your back on everyone else with their mistakes, and now they're not supporting you when you make a mistake? So I think that positive energy that you try to bring just kind of brings everyone else with you. And that's kind of what we talk about when we talk about a vocal leader versus just a star leader, and not just being, you know, all about your talent, but it's about how can I support the rest of my guys, because there's going to be a time when I need their support as well.
That's a great perspective. Okay, thank you so much.
That's a great question, Glenn. And it kind of makes me think of I feel like that discussion, while you guys were having it, makes me think of basically kind of Jameson Williams versus A.J. Brown this year. They're not the same talent or type of player, but they're handling their situation differently. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, Glenn, but J-Mo has not really gotten the amount of looks that I think he expected, and they expected with trying to have more verticality in the offense. And A.J. is obviously obviously not happy either for maybe some of the reasons that you're highlighting, but they're handling it differently. J-Mo has not had a single complaint or cryptic tweet or anything, and now that energy that Shayne's talking about has kind of come back around, and Campbell took over the offensive play calling, and the ball's coming back to J-Mo. So it is an interesting discussion of, okay, are you going to try to stay positive and then will that into existence, or do the demands for the ball help, but then that's also going to then potentially have a negative effect on the team, as Shayne was saying?
Yeah, so you're making great points, because, I think I did an article last night. Brown only has between 4 and 6 less targets than Devontae Smith. So they're both as 1A and 1B. Unlike some other teams, they're still getting targeted. It doesn't happen the way he may want it to happen. It doesn't happen in the flow. It may not be as efficient, but it's not like, Devontae Smith has 64 targets and A.J. Brown has 30. They're like separated by 6, and that's including Dallas Goedert and Saquon Barkley. So that's why I wanted to know. It's a difficult dynamic. It's something to watch, and it could sometimes be confusing to figure out if he's right, if he's wrong, or if it's just the way things are going.
It is. It's where the buy-in is so important, because they have that both teams have a lot of mouths to feed, so to speak, with all those targets that they have and the running backs and everybody that they have going. So it's interesting to watch and see what develops. But I want to come back to that a little bit, because I want to talk about not only that breakdown, but also the 2023 draft, because I think that there was a connection between the Eagles and the Lions where there was different players picked, and that was related to culture as well. So I want to pick up with Glenn after the break. Stick with Shayne and I. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. I'm back here with Glenn Erby, giving us great stuff here. It's an interesting discussion about these two teams, because they are two of the favorites in the NFC to get to the NFC Championship and get to the Super Bowl. They're doing it different ways, and that's one of the subjects I want to take care of in this second part of the interview. But it makes me think of, when we're talking about this talent thing, I know that when the 2023 draft happened, the big player, I feel like the most discussed player in that draft to a degree, was Jalen Carter, because he's clearly very talented, and the Eagles have seen that. And I feel like a lot of teams and a lot of fan bases are going, well, wait a minute, why didn't we pick this guy? But there was a pretty clear reason why he was not picked. I think the Eagles were the perfect team to get him. If I'm the Eagles, I do go after him because of the Georgia connection, because he had mentors there and people that he had played with. And so I think that was a good fit. But I know that was a guy that the Lions were potentially interested in. But I remember a Dan Campbell quote at the time basically saying, hey, when you have a culture like ours, you can only have 1 or 2 of those guys. Otherwise, that becomes the culture. And Carter's been great. This is not a point about Carter. It's more about Brown and some of the other things. But that's the type of culture that I think of when I think of the Eagles, where like they're balancing it, but they're kind of right on that line.
Yeah, I would think so. I think it's not necessarily a negative or a positive energy, but you got a lot of guys who consider themselves, I guess, alpha males who consider themselves him. You have a Saquon Barkley, you have A.J. Brown, you have a Devontae Smith. Although he's quiet, he's a Heisman Trophy winner. He's the number 10 pick in the draft. He's someone. Hurts is someone who's been doubted. And as the second pick in the draft, he, was able to take the position from Carson Wentz. He's an MVP runner-up. He has his own personality. Guys on the offensive line have their own personality. You switch over to defense, you have Jalen Carter, you have Zach Bond, you have Quinyon Mitchell. There are a lot of big, heavy personalities on there, and Sirianni does a good job of letting those guys be themselves. But like I think, the owner said last week or 2 weeks ago, he likes to look at it as intensity and not necessarily adversity or controversy. So it's a culture. It's a culture they accept, and sometimes they walk the line and they teeter the line in terms of what some may feel acceptable and what could crater a locker room. They galvanize under.
That's a good point. One of the big differences I feel like between the Lions and the Eagles are, we talked about the coaching and the culture, but really the GMs are maybe the most opposed. They're both very successful, but they do it a very different way. Howie Roseman's known for being very aggressive there, and he's done it again. They traded for a cornerback. They traded for Jalen Phillips, who there was talk of in this market, and that's what a lot of I feel like the Detroit fans look at Philadelphia with a little bit of envy in that sense, because Holmes notoriously is not very aggressive, especially when it comes to the trade deadline and giving up assets. He'll make trades, but it's usually for late round picks and guys that he wants to repurpose and kind of get a better fit for in that Detroit culture. But Phillips is already showing early returns. I could see him showing the Lions what they're missing out on here on Sunday.
I mean, I think, Roseman has his share of misses. I mean, he'll get credit. He's credited as being the best GM. He takes a swing, but, he'll acquire some guys and they may not work out. But, I mean, he's done such a good job, since passing on Justin Jefferson and using his eyes, taking the eye test, not trying to get too creative. So he has his misses, but I think he gets complimented for, constantly trying to upgrade the roster. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And, Jalen Phillips could have a really good stretch run, and depending on what someone offers him in free agency, how we could let him walk, get a third-round pick, and be cool with it. So I think that, it's two different roster building processes, but they both work. But as long as the salary cap continues to expand and there's always more money on the table, those void years, won't catch up with the Eagles and Roseman's system of roster building.
Which that's the similarity that they have, because Holmes is putting a lot of money in the future, planning on those budgets going up and the revenues going up like they have. So that's the one similarity. Shayne, I'm curious of your thoughts on this, because you were obviously in a lot of NFL locker rooms. We're talking about this bus analogy and the talent versus culture, but that's always curious to me about the trade deadline, because you got everybody finally sitting where they're supposed to sit on the bus. And then halfway through the season, halfway through your trip on the bus, now somebody leaves, and then there's another guy that's supposed to take his seat, but that might not be his seat or where he wants to sit or where he needs to sit for the team. And you've got to adjust that organism that is in NFL locker room culture to that new guy or losing the one guy and then adding another guy.
So seeing this from a player's perspective, I never got traded. I never had to deal with it. But if you can just imagine thinking your life is going to be in a certain place for a certain time, and you've embedded yourself in the community, and you've, tried to feel that identity with that city, and all of a sudden you get traded with no notice, that's a tough thing to go through. So it's a challenge psychologically, I think. Even when you have a locker room full of guys that are friends with someone and they've created bonds on and off the field, and now all of a sudden that person's gone. And now there's this new face, and it's like, who the heck is this guy? And maybe they know who they are, but it's still a matter of now we have to not only embed them, but get them into the same culture, buy into the same things, but also the personal relationships you have. Getting past, were there any, cross-field rivalries? Were there any, spats or anything like that they ever had to deal with? And then, I'll just, Thursday night dinners, okay? I always went out to dinner when I was in Cincinnati with the D linemen, and they were a tight group. And in fact, my best friend to this day is one of those guys. And when me and Frosty and a lot of the other guys would all go out to dinner, when someone was cut or injured and out for the year, like, it took a toll on us, because that was one of your brothers. And now that guy's gone, and now there's this new guy, and we're like, well, he's not as funny, or he's not as, like you feel that, and you have to adjust, because you don't have a choice. Like,
right.
That's all you can do. And it's, how well do you handle the situation versus there's nothing you can do about it. You got to handle it the right way. And I'm lucky I never had to deal with it. None of my close friends ever had to deal with it. But I always saw it as like, man, what is it like to be that guy? The new guy or the guy that had to leave? Because you're both flip-flopping roles. You're now the new guy somewhere else, and this other guy is now the new guy. And his old teammates are like, man, we miss John or Chris or whoever. I see it from a personal side more so than a team football side, because I know that those relationships can be very dire as to the structure and camaraderie that you build your culture and you board the bus together type thing. That's the way I see it.
Well, you're playing a game for 3 hours a week. The rest of the time is obviously the majority, and we've been talking a lot about the off-the-field stuff here today. It makes me think of the Seinfeld bit where he talks about how you're rooting for laundry when you're rooting for a sports team, because it's like, no, different shirt. They're wearing a different shirt. No, we can't root for them anymore. And it's like there's still players underneath that. There's personalities to your point, Shayne. But Glenn, you were talking about that with the Eagles. I feel like the Eagles kind of get used to that to a degree. It is a little bit more of a transient culture there for that team because Roseman does have a tendency to make moves, and some players have stayed and they've been able to retain them, but there's different degrees of that. The other part that I want to get your opinion on, though, because there's been a lot of discussion of injuries, especially on the Lions side, but I know the Eagles have had some major injuries, so I was curious what you've seen from the injury reports here. It's nice to talk about this stuff on Thursday as opposed to Monday when I'm typically talking about it, because there's nothing coming out, but now we can see full practice, no practice, limited practice. I'm curious where you see guys like Lane Johnson trending for Sunday here.
He's going to play, but I think it's, that's the one thing when we sit and we talk about what they're not doing that they did last year and other things. And I feel like that, that's the one aspect that's left out is, that whether it be the Super Bowl run or the lack of, rest after the Super Bowl or whatnot, the offensive line, hasn't performed like the best offensive line, whether it be injury or attrition or Mekhi Becton moving on and Tyler Steen replacing them. That's been a sore spot. So I know, you had 3 or 4 guys, 3 or 4 starters popped up on the injury report. They're all going to play, but they're all banged up. So I think that, that's something to discuss, and that's something to monitor as well in terms of why Saquon Barkley isn't having, the explosive plays he isn't having, why sometimes Jalen Hurts doesn't have enough time to, connect with A.J. Brown. So all those things are all swirling in the gumbo, per se.
I like that phrase. Well, I feel it's funny to think of Lane Johnson, being a little bit injured, because I'm thinking of maybe the biggest offensive lineman rivalry we currently have in the NFL. I didn't even think of this, but I feel like Sewell and Johnson have gone back a little bit because they're clearly 2 of the top tackles in the NFL, right. And they're both a little beat up. So they might have a little rivalry game going here. So we'll have to see how they do, because obviously with both teams, as it's true with every NFL team, the offensive line drives everything on the offense. But I'm curious how you see this game going here, Glenn. We usually like to try to get a prediction from the opposing beat writers that are covering things for us and analyzing things for us. I can't imagine you see a blowout on either side, but what do you and I imagine you would pick the Eagles, but what do you see? How do you see this game playing out?
I mean, I think it'll be a close game. You have explosive players on both sides. You have, quarterbacks who are efficient, who don't like to turn the ball over. I think for me, my biggest worry is, the Eagles have 3 really talented linebackers, but will Zach Bond, will the rookie Jahai Campbell, Nakobe Dean, which one of those guys, when matched up on Jahmyr Gibbs man-to-man, are able to, to contain him, or, what is Vic Fangio's recipe for not allowing Gibbs to go crazy in the passing game and the running game and become that ultimate dual threat? So I think in terms of, guys on the outside, both lines are good, both defenses are good, but I think that linebacker running back matchup between the Eagles defense and Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery will likely determine the game for me.
Interesting. That's an interesting one to highlight. I feel like most times people go to the receiver cornerback matchup, which the cornerbacks on the Lions defensive backfield as a whole they're a little dinged up. The Eagles have had some issues there. So, but I can see that on both sides, because obviously you got to watch Saquon Barkley from the linebacker level too. And even though he hasn't necessarily hit peak Saquon Saquon Barkley performance, it's still Saquon Barkley. You still got to look out for him. So, but we appreciate you joining the show, Glenn. Great stuff. Good conversation. We'll look forward to having Glenn back on here to review the game with us. But be sure to tell people where they can follow you, because you do Eagles Wire and Ravens Wire still, right, Glenn?
Correct. I'm the managing editor for the Ravens Wire at USA Today, Eagles Wire at USA Today. You can find me on X, Twitter at the Cover 2 NFL. And I just appreciate you guys having me on, and I look forward to coming on again. Thank you guys again.
Definitely. Hopefully we have a good game to talk about. Should be a good clash of the Titans in the NFC here, but we'll look forward to having you back on, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, guys. I feel like those two teams will definitely see each other again, so we'll certainly have this conversation at some point in January or February, but thank you again.
That's what I'm looking forward to. That's why I like doing this segment, because we've talked to a lot of teams that I feel like the Lions could see again, so hopefully we do that, because it's been a great conversation, but we'll talk to you next week here. Thanks for joining us.
Appreciate both of you guys. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Glenn.